Hello, I'm Infamous Fear. What's that? It's time for Infamous Queer!
Pride, 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 darling, darling, pride, pride 95!
Now, the LGBT world is not entirely sweetness and light, and movies reflect that. A number of movies explore the number of different ways that sexuality can be expressed, both positively and negatively. For every film out there featuring a good, respectful relationship or giddy, happy flirtation, there's always something darker, from childhood sexual abuse, repressed sexuality, hate crime, or rape. Historically, the prospect of same-sex sexual assault and the fear of being a victim has been responsible for a lot of ever-pervasive fears and negative perceptions of LGBT people. This of course ignores the fact that the overwhelming majority of sex offenders identify as heterosexual, no matter who they assault. But despite growing LGBT equality and mainstream acceptance, there's still a pervasive fear that LGBT people, particularly gay men, are the ones responsible for same-sex sexual violence. And nowhere is more well known for a horribly high rate of same-sex sexual violence than prison. Stereotypically, going to prison is a surefire way to end up being raped, and unfortunately, the stereotype does have some grounds in truth. Rape is a very real problem, particularly in overcrowded and poorly run prison systems, especially in countries that put an emphasis on punitive rather than rehabilitative criminal justice. Being confined in a single-sex environment, sometimes for years, leads to a lot of sexual behaviour between people who wouldn't otherwise consider same-sex sexual contact, and not all of that sexual contact is consensual. But prison rape isn't just a topic that's become prevalent in recent media, something we've only just become aware of. No, this time we're going to be going back in time to the dark days of 1971 to watch a film that attempts to shine a light on the horrible prevalence of prison rape. This is Fortune and Men's Eyes. Ah yes, Fortune and Men's Eyes.
Fortune and Men's Eyes. It began as a stage play of stage play of stage play of stage play of stage play of.
Sorry about that. Anyway, Fortune and Men's Eyes is a 1971 film that I can't help but be extremely wary of, given that it's based on a
Stage play
by Canadian playwright John Herbert, who wrote the play in the 1960s as an exploration of his time in the 1940s Canadian prison system. Performances of the play were viewed with shock by critics, who described it as disgusting and disturbing, particularly as it was based on John Herbert's real-life experiences. But does the film live up to the play's reputation of ghastly sleaze, or will it come across as neutered and lame to a modern audience? There's nothing to do but begin. We start the film with an inappropriately jaunty theme song, as we see prisoners leaving a chain-link fence factory and filing into a prison van. However, the music is so overbearingly bizarre that I can't help but imagine that it's one of Something Awful's inappropriate soundtracks.
When in disgrace, with fortune and men's eyes, I all alone beweep my outcast state.
Well, no matter how inappropriate the music is, rest assured, I can always make it worse. So that's what I'm going to be doing throughout this whole episode.
We're all going on a summer holiday. No more working for a week or two.
After the soundtrack from Jackie Brown has stopped playing, we see our main character, Smitty, being admitted to prison for the first time. Smitty has absolutely no idea what to expect and is unable to relate to his fellow prisoners in the way that they'd expect, thus leaving him wide open for ridicule and gay jokes.
You call me Screwdriver, a driver. You can call me. Just don't make it too early in the morning.
Hey, no school today, Mr. Smith?
Just knock twice and kiss in your ear.
Hey, baby, I saw him first.
Now, one thing you should know about this film is that every second line alludes to homosexuality, whether of the consensual or the non-consensual kind. It's blazingly obvious that seemingly every man in the prison has his eye on Smitty and is slavering for fresh meat. We're introduced to Smitty's cellmates. Rocky, a man who is seemingly unable to turn off his 1,000-watt sex eye. Queenie, a man who was so flamboyant that he made Liberace just give up. And Jan, a man so incredibly belittled that he's not even allowed to use his own name anymore.
Your name is Jan. God damn it, your name is not Jan, it's Mona Lisa!
Just in case you hadn't already noticed, there's an ongoing theme in this movie, a theme that becomes very clear when we see Mona being raped in public. Of course, Smitty is horrified and vehemently expresses his desire to avoid being victimised in the same way.
Jesus, that could be me. But it isn't.
Naturally, Rocky is keen to help him. And by help him, I mean this.
You can't get chummy with the whole joint. Especially the faggots.
Yeah, well, I sure as hell don't want anybody thinking I'm queer.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you something, man. You're a sitting duck for a gangbang if you haven't got an old man. I'd like to be your old man. You want those guys to pile on you the way they do on Mona?
Well, what do you mean? Like a buddy?
Like I'd kill any son of a bitch who lays a hand on you. You know, we look out for each other.
Okay. Okay, and thanks.
Smitty has clearly left much of his cortex at home because he's somehow stupid enough to agree to this. He's then very surprised when it turns out that Rocky wants him as something more than just a friend.
Hey, why don't we take a shower?
Shower, what? I had one this morning.
It's not gonna kill you to take another one, is it? I like company.
Tomorrow, Rocky.
Right now.
No, thanks.
Look, I like my boys clean.
I am clean.
Well, I really hate to say this kind of thing, but what were you expecting? He was giving you the sex eye the whole time! Anyway, Rocky commits the tandem sins of rape and horrendous water wastage as he forces Smitty into the shower and has his way with him. And then there's some unexpectedly jaunty music because what the fuck? Well, that music was odd. Quick, let's make it worse!
There'll be times when my crimes will seem almost unforgivable. Strange love, will you give it to me? Will you take the pain I will give to you again and again?
Enjoy your PTSD! Strangely, Smitty isn't terribly happy about this new arrangement he's unwittingly entered into with Rocky, but he decides that it's much better than being victimised by the whole cell block. So now he's essentially Rocky's unwilling slave, a fact which Queenie notices and takes issue with.
I'm not jealous, Rocky. I'm really not. But I do hate to see a nice guy playing pussy to a third-rate hustler.
Don't push me, faggot.
Oh, shit. You're talking to Queenie, baby. Not your punk, not Mona, and not Katso.
How come you're so smart for a homosexual?
How come you're so dumb for a faggot?
Roll me some smokes for later, Smitty. Then you can get ready for your shower.
Queenie decides to help Smitty, and this time help doesn't mean sodomise.
Look, you don't have to punk for Rocky. Unless you dig it. You gotta prove yourself in here, baby. I can go out there and tell everybody you're ruling here, goddammit, if you wrap Rocky up.
So what am I supposed to use? Crap paper?
Are you afraid of him?
Just figured he's the only way to keep those other pricks off my back.
Instead, Queenie covers for Smitty while he half strangles Rocky. I'm not sure why he doesn't finish the job, but anyway. After this attack, Smitty is now in charge of Rocky, as he's expressed his dominance, which we see in a scene where Smitty slaps Rocky in the face 500 million times. Rocky grows frustrated with being bitch slapped, as he would, and he snaps and tries to shiv Smitty, only to be carted away by the prison guards to the strains of yet another inappropriate soundtrack. And that's the last we'll see of Rocky.
Jesus Christ, I think we got a suicide.
Let me taste it, just to make sure. Looks like suicide. Tastes like it too. Now that Rocky's gone, Smitty uses this opportunity to try and bond with Mona. However, Smitty's time being a victim has turned him into something of a monster. And so instead of simply having a nice chat with Mona about Shakespeare, like he did before, Smitty decides that it'll be a great idea to try and force Mona to fuck him instead.
Come on, you're not blind. Who's been acting like your old man lately?
I have an old man, you know that. I don't want that situation.
You just think you do. Look, I'm gonna have to give you all this stuff. You know what I need. Haven't you got any feelings for me?
Sure I have, Smitty.
but not the kind you're getting at.
Poor Mona confesses that while he does like Smitty and he's attracted to him, he can't in any way cope with Smitty treating him as horribly as the other men in the prison do.
Look, you've got power now. What you want from me is sex. And all you're offering me is indifference. I don't want that. Not from you.
Smitty suddenly realises what he's become and breaks down. Mona comforts him.
Smitty. Smitty. I love you.
Unfortunately, what may have been the most genuine, heartfelt moment in the film, of two broken men finding each other, is quickly interrupted by the screaming presence of Queenie. Angered by the intrusion, Smitty reacts aggressively and is carted off by the guards to be stripped naked and thrown into a darkened cell alone, while more inappropriately jaunty music plays. And that's the end. Well, okay. What the fuck? So that was the plot of the film, but what of the glue that holds the story together? The characters? Are they in any way a good and accurate representation of LGBT men, or are they all offensive and terrible? Queenie is an abrasively stereotypical gay character, one very typical of the films of the time. He's blisteringly camp, to the point that he's barely tolerable. He flirts with inmates and guards alike, and is exorbitantly bitchy to just about everyone.
Poor bitch. Look at yourself. Why don't you fix your clothes? You ain't had a friggin' thing that fit you since you fell through the door.
Much like many other camp characters, he's also oddly sexless. Queenie, unlike the other men in the prison, is not a rapist, and neither is he a victim. He may be the most openly homosexual of all the prisoners, but he never has any sexual contact, consensual or not. On the one hand, this means that Queenie is never shown to be a predator. He may make Smitty uncomfortable with his explicitly open flirting.
Aren't you relieved to read once in a while?
There are other ways to get you relieved.
Queenie.
Yes.
Cool it.
But he's the one from whom Smitty has just about the least to fear. In the end, Smitty himself ends up being more of a sexual predator than Queenie is. On the other hand, Queenie isn't allowed to be actively gay or to have any kind of relationship. It's possible that he did give or receive sexual favours, but it's nothing that's ever explicitly said or seen. Hell, even Screwdriver, a character who's in the film for less than 10 minutes, is said to have had a relationship with Rocky, whereas Queenie is left to merely allude to homosexuality in a mincing, innuendo-laden way that wouldn't be out of place in a carry-on film. Well, apart from showing the whole of the prisoner's penis, I think that probably goes beyond innuendo. I'm curious as to why the other prisoners tolerate Queenie. They seem to either engage in his flirting, or they ignore him, or merely find him annoying. I'm not sure why he's granted some kind of exemption to the bullying from the other inmates and the guards, but somehow he's a protected entity in the prison, almost as if he's a mascot. Maybe prisoners just really like drag queens. They certainly seem to an M. Butterfly. In the end, Queenie doesn't get to be a positive or negative queer character, merely a painfully annoying one. Mona is the only other character who identifies as queer, but he's so victimised and submissive that he comes across like a character in a poorly written /fan fiction. Throughout the whole of the movie, he's hit, raped, bullied, belittled and sexually harassed, and it was being a rape victim that got him into prison in the first place.
I was walking home from the campus one night. These 4 guys came over and started to hassle me. They raped me. Finally, a cop came over and stopped them. But in court, they said that I had come onto them. Did you? Of course not. My lawyer didn't have time to prepare a proper defense. 6 months.
When the play was written, homosexuality was still illegal in Canada and the US, hence why Mona should be so brutally punished for not only allegedly making a pass at a man, but for being a victim of a sex crime.
How can a thing like getting in here just happen?
My life's like that. I accept whatever happens.
Well, that tells me a lot.
Strangely enough, while Mona's portrayal as an incredibly weak man who is resigned to being a victim comes across as rather offensive, or the sort of writing one would expect from someone who's fetishised emasculated and submissive men, and their reluctant but devoted suffering, his behaviour is actually fairly consistent with many victims of sexual abuse in prison. They recognise that it is safer for them to act in a weak and feminised way, and to gain the protection of one man, rather than be victimised by all men. Mona's mistake is that he hasn't managed to find the one man who will abuse him exclusively, which is a horrible choice, but a choice that many in prison face, a choice that Smitty himself is forced into. Although Mona is treated incredibly poorly by the prisoners and the storyline as a whole, he's also one of the most likeable characters in the movie, a genuinely good person whom life has repeatedly trodden upon. He's the only one who's kind to Smitty without expecting anything, who doesn't belittle the new prisoner, and who treats him like a human being with a life outside of the penal system.
What's your girlfriend's name?
Kathy.
She's pretty. Oh, that's my parents. And my twin sister, Ophira.
Ophira?
Yeah.
It's nice.
Plus, Mona is shown to be educated and intelligent. Still, no one would want to be anyone like Mona. He may be one of the kindest characters in the movie, but he's defined by his victimhood. We can only pity him in the same way that one would pity a suffering or a sick man. The same grovelling pity reserved for sinners and unfortunates, as homosexuals were thought of at the time. Rocky is possibly the thinnest character. We hear of his backstory as a live-in lover to a rich sugar daddy, but all he does in the film is leer at Smitty with bedroom eyes in a way that makes the audience wonder how Smitty could have ever been stupid enough to trust him. It's no surprise when Rocky eventually snaps, killing himself in the most dramatically unimportant and anticlimactic way, outside of an episode of the IT Crowd. No, actually, wait, that suicide was at least surprising. Rocky is probably the closest this movie comes to having a good old-fashioned homosexual villain, someone who wants a piece of the main character and has little other motivation or characterisation outside of that. Finally, Smitty, our main character, is at first characterised by his sheer naivety. He's been sent to prison for drug possession and, like Mona, is only serving a 6-month sentence. Given how overtly the other prisoners regard him sexually, it's a real testament to Smitty's blockheaded stupidity when he doesn't realise what Rocky might want from him. The man was never exactly genuinely kind to him, thus making Smitty's blind agreement to be his sexual slave seem extremely idiotic. Granted, Smitty doesn't appear to have a lot of other choices, but he's not entering the agreement knowingly and is extremely surprised and shocked when Rocky starts making advances on him. Given the time, in any other situation, ignorance of the possibility of sexual assault would make sense, but he's just seen another man being gang raped. How could anyone be that stupid? Smitty's sudden turn towards being a perpetrator of sexual violence also comes across as nonsensical. It'd be natural for him to become withdrawn and violent, both as a reaction to his rape and a way to avoid further sexual assault. But there's very little advantage in becoming a rapist as well. It's as if he now suddenly understands that a sexual impulse can override any sense of human decency, and thinks to himself, hey, that rape thing sure sounds swell, why don't I get on board with that too? Now, victims of sexual assault can end up with a very disordered view of sexuality, and some of them do go on to abuse others themselves, but that's usually in the case of people who were sexually assaulted as children and had the natural formation of their own sexuality perverted and disrupted by being victims of abuse. Here, Smitty has been in prison for a short time, and when he entered prison, he wasn't a man with psychological issues and pre-existing trauma. So why on earth does he seek to become a rapist himself? Maybe our main character's secretly just a horrible man. Well, great. The movie occupies a very strange place between drama and exploitation, and doesn't quite work as either. For a drama, the characterisation is a little on the thin side. Until the very end, we know very little about these characters, and we certainly never see anything of what they were before they entered the prison. Smitty is just about the only character who undergoes a personal change, going from naive newcomer to damaged manipulative felon, becoming what he loathes. Everyone else in the prison is static, or not much of a character at all. There's also very little in terms of dramatic build-up. Most dramatic films with the threat of sexual abuse tend to build up to the abuse, first establishing a general sense of unease before actually showing anything untoward happening. But here, the threat is established right from the beginning, and we don't have to wait very long before we see a character being gang raped. However, this assault isn't seen as a dramatic thing or any kind of catalyst. It's depicted as so astoundingly ho-hum that the film suddenly segues into a water fight in a transition that's almost more sudden and confronting than the rape itself. Well, that was strange and confusing? Quick, let's make it worse!
Don't you think it's rather funny? I should be in this position.
To put it simply, the threat does not have dramatic effect because it exists throughout the whole movie, thus making the viewer simply give up hope and not care. We know that Smitty is going to be assaulted. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. In fact, the movie was so clearly not going to end well that as soon as Smitty entered the prison, the phrase leapt out of my mouth and turned into a t-shirt. Of course, not everyone treats rape and sexual abuse as a dramatic third act development, the most horrible and confronting act of the movie. Some movies begin with an act of sexual violence, but almost without failure, these movies are not dramas, they're exploitation. Or they're windows. However, much like Windows, Fortune in Men's Eyes doesn't achieve success as an exploitation film either, despite the premise and the way that we're immediately thrown into the midst of cruel sexual violence and the nastier side of prison culture. To put it bluntly, it's just not sleazy enough. The soundtrack is stupidly jaunty, but not nearly cheery enough to provide a dramatic and dissonant contrast. The lighting is as flat and bright as a daytime talk show, and the atmosphere is shallow and underdeveloped. What the prisoners go through is undoubtedly a storyline worthy of an exploitation, but there's very little dramatic conclusion, no sense of retribution or revenge. In an exploitation flick, Smitty and Mona would have gotten their well-justified revenge on their rapists, and it wouldn't be a mere beating like Smitty administers to Rocky. No, in this case, the vengeance that fell upon the heads of the rapists would equal or even exceed the brutality they subjected their victims to. But here, most of the rapists escape being punished more than they already are. And indeed, in the one moment when Smitty and Mona have a positive interaction and are truly able to understand one another, Smitty is discovered by Queenie and punished for daring to treat another prisoner like a human being. That's not exploitation, that's just oppressing. Many of the potential villains in the film are simply callous and indifferent rather than truly evil. Rocky provides a threatening enemy in the form of a sexually manipulative cellmate, and most of the prisoners are brutish and sexually violent. But the guards, who could have been depicted as much more violent and sadistic, simply don't seem to care. Even when the guards beat a man to death, the act isn't treated with exploitative sleaze, more as something that happens and has very little bearing on the plot at all. This isn't an exploitation film or a drama. Things just happen in the prison, and they're nearly all bad. If there's one genre which this film is closest to, I'd say pornography. The basic premise of a prison full of men looking to fuck each other just sounds like something that would be shown in a porn theatre in the gay district. The incredibly casual way that sexual relations of any kind are portrayed does seem like something out of the porn universe. The strange universe that runs parallel to our own, in which everyone is up for sex and any non-consensual encounter very quickly turns into a consensual one. Hell, half of the characters even talk like they're in porn.
Oh yeah. Do it, baby.
One would also expect the rapists in a mainstream film to be portrayed as ugly and more brutish, not as good-looking men walking around with their shirts unbuttoned. It definitely doesn't count as pornography, seeing as it doesn't glorify gay sex, and instead turns it into something ugly that people are routinely forced into. But the narrative structure really wouldn't be out of place in the world of adult cinema. All in all, it's an odd viewing experience, more baffling than disturbing. Confusing atmosphere aside, there are things to like about Fortune in Men's Eyes. The acting works, and the plot and scenario are definitely ambitious and really quite confronting for the time. Even though the play was written in the 60s and the movie released in 1971, there's still quite a lot that the movie gets right.
While we don't know how many men are raped in prison, we do know from the available research that the kinds of prisoners most likely targeted are young, non-violent, short sentence offenders.
How long's your sentence? 6 months. Mine too.
Same-sex sexual behaviour is portrayed as a complex thing, and not necessarily directly related to homosexuality. There's an underlying criticism of locking up men in prison for victimless crimes, where they'll experience conditions far more brutal than anything they would have ever subjected anyone to on the outside. The prison guards are shown to be indifferent at best and sadistic at worst, and do not even attempt to protect the vulnerable, let alone punishing prisoners who rape and assault their fellow inmates. Although the atmosphere is lacking, the movie pulls no punches in its portrayal of sexual violence. Part of this willingness to confront uncomfortable issues is due to the playwright John Herbert's own experiences in prison. He was attacked by a group of men and sent to prison after the men invoked the gay panic defence, saying that they'd attacked him because he made a pass at them. Since homosexuality was illegal at the time, Herbert was the one who was punished. Thankfully, by the time this film was released, gay sex had become legal in Canada, meaning that no other men could ever be punished for Herbert's crime. One thing that I can say about this film is that it isn't insulting. It's hardly positive in terms of its portrayal of LGBT people, but much of the brutal way the inmates behave is due to inherent problems in the prison system, rather than a perception that LGBT people are necessarily evil predators. Indeed, the film makes it very clear that LGBT men in prison are much more likely to be victims of sexual assault rather than perpetrators. Still, I wouldn't show it to a homophobe. So, the film was shocking at the time, but is it worth watching it all today? Well, maybe. I'm not really sure this film is for everyone. It's certainly unlike anything I've ever seen before, but I'm loath to recommend it, owing to its odd atmosphere and unsatisfying conclusion. It's an uneven film, due to its origins as a play, and it seems very uncertain about what kind of film it wants to be. If you want a better portrayal of a vulnerable and scared man growing hardened and callous by his time in prison, I'd suggest watching Criminal Justice instead. If you want to watch a critically acclaimed and dramatically successful film about a man entering the prison system and encountering sexual violence, The Shawshank Redemption might be better. If you'd like to watch something sleazier, go and watch an exploitation film. I'm sure there are loads out there that would fit the bill. But if you'd like to see a little slice of queer cinematic history, by all means, give it a watch. I'm not going to stop you. So that was Fortune in Men's Eyes. And now, if you'll excuse me, I think I need a shower. No, wait, no!
Number 47 said to number 3. You were the cutest jailbird I ever did see. I sure would be delighted with your company. Come on and do the jailhouse rock with me. Let's rock. Go, go, go! Everybody, let's rock. Lay it on me, daddy-o! Everybody in the whole hotel block.
Clitty. Oh, fuck.